All right, gang, you made it. The last session of day 2 of this track. And it is pretty exciting. We've got Elspeth and George from Morgan Stanley talking about how they're building a developer platform based on Spring Initializer. And if you don't know what Spring Initializer is, well, it is just awesomeness. If you are doing anything with Spring, you need this. It helps package all the things that you need, the dependencies, libraries, whatever, and get you started quickly. So, and I think this project is pretty cool and kind of innovative and where the future is headed in dev platforms. So check it out.
My name's Elspeth Minty. I'm here with my colleague George Ball. We're from the Java platform engineering team at Morgan Stanley, and we're going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing on the Initializer platform that underpins start.spring.io. So as developers, we all want to be more productive. We want to be spending our time doing some of the really cool stuff we've been hearing about over the last couple of days. We don't want to be reinventing the wheel, writing code that other people have already written, or stuff that could be easily automated. This is why we use IDEs. It's why we use frameworks like Spring and testing tools. These things make us more efficient, more productive, so we can spend time on the stuff that we really want to be doing. But what about when we start off a new project? So picture the scene. You're in front of your laptop. The powers that be have just signed off on this really cool new project, and you've got all these ideas floating around in your head. The architecture you want to use, all the different designs that you want to try out. So you go to your IDE, you open a new project, and you're confronted by an empty editor. I don't know about anyone else, but empty editors absolutely terrify me. I have a complete phobia of them. I want to just fill them up with code. And what I usually end up doing is just going to another project, copying a file over, and just changing a few things. And this is a really bad thing to do. You end up with the same piece of code going from project to project. It gets really outdated. You're sharing bad practice. It's a terrible thing to do. A better idea is to take some example code as a starting point. But it's really difficult to find an example that does exactly what you want. You end up going from across multiple different examples, taking a bit from one, a bit from another. You cobble it all together and you hack it until it works. But there's more to an application than just the code. There's the build files, the dependencies, the CI configuration, the deployment scripts. There's all the scaffolding that goes with the application. And this is where start.spring.io has been fantastic. For people like me, the empty editor phobes, it's been such a joy to use. It means that I can start off and get a basic outline of my project, and it gives me something to work from. So a year or so ago, George and I were having a chat, and we were talking about Initializer. And George mentioned that it's an open source project. It's a configurable open source project. Why don't we just bring it in-house? We can set it up. Maybe we can even get it to work with our own proprietary libraries. And we'll release it and see what our users think. So we did this. And hence was born MS Initializer, the Morgan Stanley Initializer. And it's essentially the same thing as the open source Initializer project. The UI looks a little bit different. When I took the snapshot for the slides, we were running a slightly older version than the open source one, but it's essentially the same project. And we were able to configure it. We only support Java. We don't support Kotlin or Groovy. We limit the number of Spring Boot versions that are available. We only support the released the released Spring Boot versions. We don't support the pre-released or snapshot versions. And it's not obvious through the UI, but we actually don't go directly to the open source repositories like Maven Central. We have our own in-source cache that fronts these open source repositories. And this is the same cache that our proprietary libraries get published to. But it's essentially the same. It works exactly the same way. All the Spring starters are there, and we were able to configure in our proprietary libraries very straightforwardly. So we have a couple of authentication libraries, we have corporate directory, the standard kind of thing that you would expect to see. So we got this set up. We wrote a couple of blogs. We released it to our developers, and we were completely astonished by the response that we got. They absolutely loved it, and they wanted more. So we were trying to think about what more could we actually do with Initializer. And about the same time, we saw a presentation that Stefan Nickel, one of the original developers on the Initializer project, he did this talk on how to generate an empty project. And that sounds like such a trivial thing to do, but it completely changed the way that we thought about Initializer. So we realized that we all know that you can use Initializer to generate Spring Boot projects. That's what we do every day. But if we can also use Initializer to generate an empty project, we can generate anything. So we realized that Initializer was a really, really powerful tool, not just to provide the scaffolding for the projects, but really potentially to really help drive best practice. So we realized that if we could already generate Maven and Gradle build files, we can generate configuration for CI, we can generate deployment scripts. You already get a bit of code in an entry point piece of code when you generate a project with Initializer. We can generate more code. And particularly, we can generate code along with the dependencies in the starters. So when you pick the starter that you want, you get a piece of code that comes along with it. And it means that you can tailor your example to the functionality that you want. We also, if we can selectively display content based on the JDK or the Spring version, and we know we can do this if you use Initializer and you pick particular versions of Spring Boot, then you see slightly different dependencies, or slightly different starters available because of of what's supported across the different versions. So if we can do this, then we can generate different example code depending on which starters are selected. And specifically, if you're selecting reactive starters, we can generate reactive examples. So we realized that Initializer really gave us a big opportunity to make, not just to help drive best practice, but to make best practice really the simplest thing for our developers to do. So I'm going to hand over to George, who's going to go into a bit more detail on how Initializer works and how we're able to do this.
Thanks, Elspeth. The kind of things that we were thinking of that we were going to want to do to Initializer to achieve the goals that we were setting for ourselves were clearly not the kind of things that you were going to be able to do just simply by tweaking configuration files here and there. We were going to have to go inside a little bit and alter some of the more detailed and more low-level aspects of how Initializer does its job. And so to do this, we need to understand a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes. You've seen in many of the talks over the last couple of days, you've seen people mention start.spring.io, and you'll have seen some examples where people have used the website to actually generate a starter project to get things started. So we needed to find out what was going on when that magic generate button was pressed. Now, Initializer's been around for about 7 or 8 years now, and it started off life as a fairly simple script-driven web application. But it's evolved into really quite a sophisticated Spring Boot application in its own right. And when you press the generate button on the web page, having made your selections according to what's presented to you and chosen your dependencies, then a request is parceled up and sent across to a RESTful endpoint, which is fronting the main workhorse of the initializer, which we know as the generator. Now, the request will be unpacked through this API and presented into the generator, which will then use its own knowledge and also a fair amount of the configurability that's provided via a metadata store to do the work that we're asking for it. The same thing will happen if you press the Explore button on the web page, where we still have to generate the project, but we don't archive it up and pass it back to the client. It's just presented as a view in a view manner. So here we have this RESTful API that fronts the generator. And once you've got a RESTful API like this, then the choice of client that you're going to use opens up quite considerably. And it turns out that in many cases, in fact, almost half the cases that people have used the open source version of Spring Initializer, they haven't used it from the web page itself. They've used it from an IDE plugin. And the IDE plugin presents the same information that's presented on the actual web page, but it parcels up the same request that's sent to the same API, which causes the same project to be generated and to be returned. And IDE plugins are available now for all of the major IDEs that are used in Java development. And as I said already, statistics gathered from the open source project indicate that it's used pretty much as many times as the web page itself is. But of course, there's even more possibilities as well, because we have many command line HTTP clients that will also send the same RESTful request into Initializer to have the work done for it. Obviously, there's a little bit more work involved because you typically have to handcraft the HTTP request. It looks a little bit more cumbersome, but there are many of these command line HTTP clients, such as curl or wget or HTTPy. And when we're working from the command line, once we start doing this, it opens up the possibilities of scripting calls into Initializer as well. So the possibilities here are pretty widespread in terms of how we interface to it. But we're still going to have to investigate what actually happens once the RESTful API is invoked and the request starts to be processed. So what the API will do is it will unpackage the HTTP request itself and construct a document which is called the project description. And that then becomes the input to the main generation functionality. So what the generator will do is there are two steps essentially that we need to follow here. And they're encapsulated inside a low-level API, which is available for people to investigate and to actually use to build their own similar kinds of platforms and tools. And what the generator does is it essentially builds an application context. We are talking here about a Spring application after all. And so an application context is constructed for every request that comes in, for every project generation request that comes in. And this is going to take care of doing all of the hard work. There are two steps to the actual the generation. The application context will be populated with one or more, usually a lot more, Spring beans, which do all of the hard work. And then these Spring beans are then invoked one at a time. Each of them will contribute something to the actual project that we're building, or it will be used to customize, to tweak the actual project description document itself, just to change a little bit the way things are done. Now, the simplest example, Elspeth's already mentioned here, is where we don't even have a contributing bean at all, in which case the generator will just return an empty project. Well, that's not really an awful lot of good. But if we can also take it one step further and handcraft a simple contributor bean, which simply produces an arbitrary text file with some content in it. But again, that's all we need to do, and the generation capabilities take care of the rest of it and return the project to us as we see fit. And this is essentially, if we increase the number of beans and the sophistication of the checks that they're and the actions that they're performing, we have the capability to construct projects of almost arbitrary complexity. In fact, the actual knowledge that Initializer uses to generate a populated Spring Boot project based on the dependencies that you've chosen is all encapsulated in a collection of these contributor and customizer beans. So this is the possibilities here are huge. Now, the actual construction of the application context and the population of that context with beans is performed using what's essentially an extension of the capabilities that Spring Boot gives us for auto-configuration of its own applications. The beans that are written, the contributors or the customizer beans, are annotated with essentially conditional creation annotations. And these can be specified in terms of information that's held inside the project description document itself. For example, if we've selected that we want to build a project whose build system is Maven, then there's no need to generate any content that's connected with any other build system, such as Gradle. And so all the beans which are connected with Maven builds will be instantiated and they'll be added to the context, but none of the Gradle ones will. And we can make these selections of which beans are to be used using some fairly detailed requirements. So we can arrange for some beans to be created only when a particular dependency has been added into the project description itself. And so we have a lot of possibilities available to us. But as you say, once these beans themselves are added into the context, the generator will then invoke the functionality of them. Each of them will either modify the description or the metadata that's been passed in, or they'll cause a particular piece of the project to actually be generated. As an example, we use a customizer to take care of an additional option that we present to the user to allow a Gradle project to be created with either the Groovy DSL or the Kotlin DSL. The open source start.spring.io tends to select that, make that selection for you automatically. But we only support the development of Java projects. However, we'd like to be able to support build files implemented using the Kotlin DSL. And so we can make that switch simply through a creation of a customizer which detects whether or not this is what the user wants and arranges for that functionality to be added. Once the actual project itself has been generated, then it's archived, obviously, and sent out back to the client, either as a zip file or as a tar.gz file. And that operation is something that we haven't touched for the time being. In fact, we can return any of the requested entities. It's not just an entire project, for example, that could be requested. It may just be the build file that's being requested, whether it's Maven or Gradle. And we still adhere to all of that, but with all the customization and contributing capabilities that are necessary. So what we see now is the ability for these contributors to do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to generating the projects. And in fact, all of our the stuff that we're adding is going to be added as much as we can anyway, in the form of contributors and customizers. And we're packaging these contributors and customizers into libraries, into separate jar files, and making them available. Because obviously the idea of beans of Spring Boot is to see what's available in the current class path, and then based on the conditional instantiation, to add that functionality in to your application. So we see that we can add functionality to what the builder is actually doing simply by adding in new libraries containing contributors and customizers, and having them involved in the actual build process itself. And we also see it's possible for other development teams within the company to develop their own sets of contributors and customizers, for example, to support libraries that they're building, and have them added in to an instance of our MS Initializer simply by adding them into the class path. So there's a lot of interesting possibilities opening up at this point. So you can see we're leveraging essentially the basic capabilities of Spring Boot and the existing Initializer platform to do what we think are helpful things for our developers. Conditional generation, as I've already mentioned, if we detect that someone has selected the web dependency, either the reactive web or the MVC web, then we will automatically generate and provide an example controller based on those appropriate the appropriate APIs to illustrate how a controller could be built. If they've additionally selected our custom-built authentication dependencies, then we'll incorporate authentication onto the endpoints that are in our controller. This serves really two purposes. I mean, one is obviously it makes the job of the developers that little bit easier because they can see how things are expected to be done. But more importantly, it gives us the ability to promote, maybe not enforce, but certainly to promote and push the best practices as to how we internally expect endpoints to be authenticated when they're used. So it's more than just writing code for the sake of writing code. Our ability to the ability to package these beans into separate libraries and somehow incorporate them into instances leads us to to being able to offer the creation of specific instances of MS Initializer that could potentially be used in different areas of the firm, each of which has its own particular sets of customizations that are going to be available for people to use. Again, we've mentioned this already, that developers from certain teams may wish to add that facility into Initializer to make their libraries easier to incorporate. When it comes to building code for interaction with the CI/CD platform, this is something that we really need to provide support for, because it's something that does need a fair bit of boilerplate code to actually have it working correctly. And lastly, and possibly most excitingly, we're looking at ways in which we can capture the information that was used to build a project initially, and to make use of that to support the evolution of a project that we originally built, but somehow we want to make some changes to, even if it's just version changes. We think that it's going to be possible to automate and support that.
So this is a very kind of high-level view of the kind of things that we've been looking at. But we think there's even more that we can do with Initializer. So at the moment, we're looking at individual applications. But most systems nowadays, there's more than one thing running inside them. You have the core application, the core services, but you generally have configuration services. You might be running Prometheus for metrics. You might have gateways. Can we generate this whole ecosystem in one go? The command line with Initializer is also really appealing. And can we come up with workflows? So things like, for example, Spring Cloud Gateway, we use as a library we get it as a library, we build it with the configuration, the routes that we want, and we release it. So there's a very obvious workflow there that we could perhaps use the command line to take people through. This is how you these are the things that you need to specify for the configuration. This is how you set up the routes, and at the end of that, you get a self-contained gateway that is ready to be deployed. As George said, the kind of holy grail on this is can we use it to update projects? I think really updating is really difficult to do, but there's things that we think we can do. So if you're migrating, for example, from one cloud platform to another, there's equivalent libraries that you would be using. Also, if you have a sandbox project that you're just trying out and you decide that you want to release it, putting that inside or adding into that a CI configuration or deployment scripts, that kind of thing we think we should be able to do. So I hope this has been an interesting view of what we're doing with Initializer. It's a really flexible platform, and I hope this is going to encourage you to try it for yourselves. Thank you very much.
Well, gang, you made it. This has been a great day. I want to thank you for sticking with us. And it's been an honor to usher you through this track and to be associated with such a great event. I love this event. So have an awesome evening, afternoon, whatever. And remember to be excellent to each other. Bye.